Good morning, everyone. My name is Brenda Jimenez. I'm CEO of Mentor New York, and welcome to our wellness webinar series. We've been doing these the last couple of months to try to bring experts to the table to start to address some of the issues that have and concerns and interests that our programs have had across the state around how to navigate leadership during this particular time. Today we'll be talking to Glenn Thomas. Can your heart really drive change? The secrets of leading and working during uncertain times. And as a person who focuses on strategy and systems for the majority of my career, Glenn was a colleague of mine that always reminded me that a little heart in the game was always important. So I think that this is an important aspect of leadership, an important conversation to have at this point and juncture of sort of our realities. As you know, what we'll do is for an hour, this is a listening session and conversation between Glenn and I. Glenn and I have had conversations like this hundreds of times, and I always think somebody should be paying attention. We say pretty interesting stuff. And he's also very profoundly deep and insightful. And so what we'll ask you to do is to ask your questions in the chat box. We'll try our best to get to them by the end of the session. But if we don't, we actually do a little bit of a wellness webinar over time and do a mentoring take 2, where we actually address every answer in the chat box to make sure we get to them. And then we send out the recording to everyone so you can watch it at your leisure. But we try to address the questions that come in because we think that that's really important. So I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing you to Glenn Thomas. Like I mentioned before, he's a good friend of mine, and we've worked together for a couple of years in this mentoring movement in another organization. And so he is the author of Heart Work, 19 Expressions of Heart-Centered Leaders. He's also the founder and managing partner at Leadership Matters Group, an executive leadership and consulting firm. Glenn has worked in the private, public, and nonprofit sector and understands the constructs of organizations and how they impact the people that work in them and are served by them. He's a motivational speaker and executive leadership facilitator who believes that every human being is inherently great. He studies leadership because he adamantly believes that leadership and life are inextricably connected. And Glenn is a doctoral student, lecturer, and proud community advocate, but mostly he regards himself as a lover of life, people, and experience. And I welcome him, and also wanted to let the movement and mentoring programs and youth development programs know that we've worked in the youth development space. So I think this was really important to have a conversation about leadership management and impact of young people at this point. So I welcome you, Glenn. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. So, a recent author,
Yeah.
and someone who is, engaged in community, and as a Black man in this country experiencing what we're all experiencing, right? The reality of a global pandemic, the reality that, a little less than 2 months ago, we all witnessed the murder of George Floyd before our eyes. And so I think the best way to start this is to ask, how are you doing, and how do you navigate as a Black man knowing those realities in this particular time?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of wild that I know you would ask me that type of question, and yet that's one of the most perplexing questions I think I have to answer every single day. I am day by day dealing just like everyone else, getting up in the morning, trying to figure things out, for the most part. But more importantly, though, I am encouraged and I am hopeful. And I say that not to dismiss the true hurt and pain and agony and frustrations and emotions that so many people are having. I say that because it's necessary. So I am every day and every morning getting up and just really being encouraged and being hopeful that we are moving forward in this moment, in this watershed moment that we're having as a nation, but really as as a world community, as a global community that we're having. And so I'm doing well. My family's well. I pray for all families right now, but my family's well, and we're taking it day by day and being present in this moment. So I'm well. I appreciate that.
No, thanks for sharing. I think it's something that if we're going to talk about the heart of the matter, right, we have to
Yeah.
pause and do is ask people, how are they doing and how are they navigating? Um, so as you know, we're in the mentoring space, and many of our program leaders and staff are some of the most compassionate and giving individuals in our community. I don't think that you do
Yeah.
this work because you don't have your heart in it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and for us, what we've experienced when, New York City, Glenn is in North Carolina, so understanding that Glenn is going through the peak that New York City went through um, in March and April, right?
Yeah.
Um, and our mentoring program staff and leaders have really become the frontline workers, youth development, school leaders, right? The frontline workers for our young people as they sort of navigate physical distancing, virtual learning, the economic hardship, the impact that COVID has had on their families, the amount of loss that people have experienced. And then you add to that the fact that um, there's an uprising of awareness and sort of this uprising of racial injustice in the space and how it impacts young people. Um, what advice do you have for those frontline workers at those different sort of pinnacle levels in young people's lives
Yeah.
about, how they do this work at this point?
Yeah. So I have a couple of, I think, strategies or thoughts about that. I think first and foremost, though, before I even jump into the strategies and ideas, is first that I believe that we must give ourselves grace every single day. And I mean grace in the sense of the definition of unmerited favor, meaning we're going to do some things wrong. We're going to have bad days. We're going to experience the ups and downs of all of what you just described. But within that, we have to give ourselves grace, even if we feel as though we don't deserve it. And so I think that's the first and foremost, like not being so hard on ourselves, not getting so down on ourselves, but perfect circumstance and situation. But we can actually, in an imperfect situation, respond in a manner that allows for us to learn and grow and respond in the fashion that we are built for. I say all that to say this. I think there are three things that we can really focus on. And I do speak about these three things in the book. Hard work. The first is really practicing extreme gratitude. I think the way we start each day is important. And I have a sign in my office that says, start each day with a grateful heart. And some people say, that's kind of easier said than done. But if you really think about it, the way we start our days really helps us position ourselves to really get through some of the most difficult times in our days. And so starting with extreme gratitude really means that we are focused on sometimes some simple things, like just focusing on breath. The idea that I woke up this morning and I have another opportunity, or focusing on the great things that you believe can happen in this day. And just really, again, situating yourself in a way of gratitude that we understand that we have another opportunity each and every day. So I think extreme gratitude is the first piece of advice I would share with everyone that's listening and viewing this. The second piece, though, is being intentional about our purpose. So intentional purpose really, again, connects with our ability to not focus on the distractions, focus on the social media posts and the things in the news that get us down, that get us frustrated, but continue to focus on the intentional purpose that you have as a leader, as a servant leader, working with young people, working with constituents, working with donors, working with whomever it is that you are focused on to help serve young people and serve your community in a better way. Intentional purpose is something that we must practice and that we must, again, connect with ourselves on a daily basis. And then the third would be a powerful one, one that I believe in the most, that we must do, and you're probably going to know where I'm going with this, is that we have to have a a being within ourselves of resilient love. Listen, MLK said it the best. Dr. Martin Luther King, he said, look, hate can't drive out hate. Only love can drive out hate. And resilient love is a love that the Greeks spoke about, right? The agape love, the love that in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the challenges that we face every single day, in the midst of all the frustrations, again, that we're having, the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows, the resilient love is the love that comes into being when we want to retreat, when we want to go hate with hate or anger with anger and frustration with frustration. Resilient love then comes into a being in a place that we're able to lean back into our circumstances, our situation, and be present with a love that's unwavering, that's unconditional, that's selfless, that's a benevolent love, that's altruistic. And so I believe that if we can cap off every single day, begin it and end it with resilient love, I think we're going to be in a better position to serve those who need us the most.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said that because I think part of the reason we started this wellness webinar, I think for us as you're working with young people, if you are not really paying attention to how you show up, right? We always say show
Yeah.
up as your authentic self, show up as, understanding what space you're in.
Yep.
If we are unaware of how we show up, then we can't allow ourselves to really listen and pay attention and be in tune with what that young person, how that person is showing up.
Yeah, I think that's tremendous. And I'll say this, Pema Chodron is a Tibetan Buddhist, and she's an author. Pema Chodron recently, she has her latest book. It's called Welcoming the Unwelcome. And I've been pushing that book for people to go read it because I think it's such a relevant book. It's so meaningful right in this moment. She speaks about a place of what she calls cool emptiness. And it's a place where most of us try to avoid. We try to avoid feeling empty, right? We try to avoid the things that are frustrating us. We try and get distracted. And I think what she's speaking about is so relevant. This place of cool emptiness where we look inside ourselves, where we take a moment to be present in a moment that we would typically run away from. And as leaders, as those who are working with young people, they sense when we're not present, right? They sense when we're not right there in that moment, being honest and authentic with them, age appropriate honest, but honest nonetheless. And so I believe that her notion of cool emptiness, a place that we can take ourselves to really reflect on what we're feeling, how we're feeling, is critically important before we even sit with a young person or we sit with a constituent, so that we can be our authentic selves in an honest way and being present in that moment.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because I think a lot of people have struggled, especially around topics of racism,
Yeah.
becoming more anti-racist in our behavior. On I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to say something wrong. I don't want to be pegged as a racist.
Yep.
What am I supposed to do first, second, third? And sometimes for many of our staff and our mentors, the person of color or the Black youth that they're working with is one of the few Black people that they are interacting with. So it gets very highlighted for individuals, right? And so I
Yeah.
think being able to,
Definitely.
your point, do that introspective work to be able to show up with love and to understand that really listening and being intentional about how you respond from a place of love can help you navigate how to be present at this moment in a way that's thoughtful and that's authentic and honest, to be able to say, I don't know. I don't know anything about that, or
Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar, or
Yep.
I could hear what you're saying, but I don't know what that feels like. That is all okay. And I think um, we're always looking for this magic bullet. What's the book? What's the thing? And to your point, the answer is within, right? Um,
It's
and
within.
yeah, and that's a real sort of fundamental, reality of take care of yourself, pay attention to yourself to do this work. But then there's this really realistic reality that you and I have experienced as folks of color in organizations, and it's being the only,
Yeah.
right? And at some point it was
Yep.
just me and you, and then a few others came in, but we're still in a construct of 300-400 people, right? And feeling like that we're
Yep.
representing an entire community. So there were many occasions where Glenn and I were in a conversation, and it was like, well, what's wrong with Black men? Why aren't they volunteering? And they'd all look to Glenn like, just let us know what's wrong with the entire population. And so my question to you
Yeah.
is, as you're doing this heart work and you're talking to leaders and managers and staff, what advice do you give folks as they're managing circumstances where many times you only have an only person of color, a representative from one community? What should they start to sort of consider doing to be able to create maybe spaces of belonging, inclusiveness that we always talk about? If
Yeah,
you can,
definitely. I
go ahead.
mean, we've had a number of conversations about that, right? I mean, and, oh, can you hear me now?
Yep. Hmm.
Can you hear me? You can? Oh, okay. So I think, the first place for me is that we understand that your voice is necessary. Like, voices are necessary, and silence is deafening. And you and I have had this conversation about, when do you speak up? Do you speak up? Do you share? What do you share? And I think first and foremost, we have to know that our voices are necessary, and that we have to be able to understand what that voice can do, the power of that voice, and that the silence is deafening. And because it's so deafening, those who we seek to inspire or empower or move, if we are silent, then it just becomes that much harder for them to hear us. I think that's the first thing that I would say. I think the second is that we must use anger in an appropriate way. Anger is actually necessary, and but it's a type of anger that we need to use. It's what I love to research, different terms and all these strategies and philosophies, and assertive anger is the thing that I landed on, is the terminology that I landed on. Assertive anger is this type of anger by which we are assertive with our voice, right? We're using our voice, we're not being silent, but we're doing it in a way that is inclusive, that is welcoming people to the table. Because you're right, I don't speak for all Black men in America, yet I do have my own Black man experience, and I do have an opinion and a thought that's based on some just independent opinions, but also research, right? Because I'm a researcher. And so those are my experiences. So, to that degree, assertive anger is very essential. Sister Joan Chittister, who's a nun, she's an author of over like 50 books. She's well written, 700 plus articles. She speaks about how anger is indeed necessary, even coming from a place of Christianity, of faith, right? People would say, no, I don't think anger and faith go together. Yes, they do. Because people need to understand that there is a place deeply embedded within us, from our heart and our mind, that we are frustrated in many cases, in many instances. And so being assertive with that anger is very essential. The third thing I would say is that we must choose courage over fear. Um, I think that I don't want to dismiss at all when people make calculations about their livelihoods. I think we can't be dismissive. We know that in certain situations, we have to be calculated, and we have to think about, do I say something because of the culture here? Do I send this email? Do I raise my voice through an assertive anger manner? Will it benefit me, right? Churchill said something. He said, fear is basically a reaction and courage is a decision. And I think, and I think right now, in this moment, in 2020, man, I'm choosing courage, and I'm encouraged by other people choosing courage in moments where they may not have in the past, where we see the bubbling point where a global community is responding to George Floyd, not just America.
Right.
And so choosing that courage over fear, I think, is indeed the space that we should land in. Those are the three spaces that I would really encourage folks to take grasp of and try and activate for themselves.
Yeah, and I think those are universal realities, right? Whether you're sitting
Yeah.
in the chair as a person of color, as a Black individual,
Yep.
as a white individual, the reality is that all those pieces are important in order for us to work through whatever organizational changes, whatever behavioral changes we want to see in our staff and in our teams and in young people. But I'm with you. I am hopeful and encouraged with the fact that young people have had an amount of courage to elevate this
Yes.
conversation in a way that it has never been elevated before. And it's done
Yep.
from a place of knowledge and strategy. And so it's been really amazing to watch. And one of the things that I think I want to encourage our programs is to tap into that, right? There is this sort
Yep.
of misconception that we have to develop that in our young people. And I think, you said it, everybody is brilliant, everybody has potential, regardless of their race, creed, or religion, right? And so,
Yep.
really, what our role is to tap into that, because I've had conversations with people that are saying, well, young people wanted to do this and we were fearful and we were sort of trying to be adults about it. And they looked at us and said, get out of the way, we'll make this happen. And not only did
Yep.
they make it happen, they did it in a way that was thoughtful and strategic. And I think sometimes we've got to get out of the way and allow for that courage to bubble up for the change to happen. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you have young kids, I have toddlers. Look, the biggest step for me as a parent was to get out of their way. It's they're on standing 5 steps high. They want to jump. I don't want them to jump. I'm scared they're gonna break something. Uh, look, it's what we deal with every single day. But what we have seen, 13-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 5 and 6-year-olds that are living this fight in this moment.
Yeah.
I mean, we all we can do right now for the purposes of moving this forward in a way that is going to be meaningful and substantive for everyone involved is to get out of our young people's way. Give them room to be themselves, to live out their inherent greatness because they have it. They want to release it, and
Yeah.
to that point, it's just let them be courageous, and we need to just step out of the way and be courageous enough to let them lead the way. Young people have led every movement that matters in this
Yep.
country,
It's
in
very
this
true.
world. Young people.
Yeah, it's very true. And part of it is what you talk about, right? As you get older, there's more at stake. So the fear factor just multiplies, right? So
Yeah.
I was thinking about that the other day as my 12-year-old was talking about her activism. And I thought, what happened,
Yes.
Stephanie? And I thought, oh, yeah, I've got kids and a mortgage. And,
Yep.
and we start to play in sort of our lanes. And to your point, when you become introspective about that reality and connect with that, then you allow yourself that courage to be able to say something, to stand up. And I think for our youth movement, the courage comes in the self evaluation, right? Because I think there's this misconception that because we do serve Black and Brown youth, then we are not part of a systemic problem, right? And so my push, even as a leader to this organization, is to say, no, we have an obligation to look at ourselves and say, here's what we've been doing well, good,
Yep.
and here's where we have to double down and start making some changes to really allow for the equity and inclusion that we want to happen in organizations to happen. So I think one of my questions is, I'm doing this introspective work, right? I'm having some
Yeah.
courage. Clearly, we need a lot of self care. I have organizations who have spoken to me where staff have lost colleagues, multiple colleagues, right? They're talking to young people who have lost multiple family members. And I remember being in meetings nationally where the rest of the country is sort of like, wow, that's deep. And now the rest of the country is sort of experiencing the same thing, right? We almost can't run away from this collective grief that will be happening in community. And so my question is sort of, our organizations and our leaders are grappling with a lot of stuff. Where do they even start systemically to look at how to deconstruct behavior that is detrimental to inclusion and belonging? How do we start looking at what equity really looks like when I'm confronted with all these external factors that are immediate, right? There's an immediate need for food and shelter. There's an immediate need for technology so that kids can learn. There's an immediacy to everything. How do you advise to even start the work as a leader? What do you start looking at as a staff person? What do you start looking at?
Yeah. So I think that that's first off a huge
Yeah, no, I didn't give you an easy question.
question. I know that's why you asked it. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Hmm.
Yep. Okay. So I think that's a huge question. So thank you. Uh, and I believe a few things. I believe first you have to, I have a client, a personal experience. I have a client now. They've lost two staff members, and one was definitely due to COVID-19. And yet, again, to your point, so many other things are happening, and we're trying to figure out this system, right, that still exists. I will liken it to someone who I look up to, who I admire, and I really listen to. Brian Stevenson is the executive director of Equal Justice Initiative and an attorney, Just Mercy, the book and the movie. And I had the privilege of hearing him speak in person. He was here in Davidson, North Carolina, a few months ago. And he was speaking about how we address the injustice in our country. And I want to steal two of his points from him because I think they're just relevant
Hmm.
right now. The first point is that he said that we must get proximate to the matter. And when he said it, it hit me, it struck me. I asked myself immediately, Glenn, are you proximate?
Hmm.
And how close are you to the matter of injustice? Whether you're a black man in America or a white man in America, white female, whoever you may be, non-black, are you proximate? Are you proximate in heart and in mind? And this is where I want to go with this. In heart, are you able to really feel what the black experience is as it relates to this system of oppression, right? The system of oppression, the systemic idea is that there are four areas: individual, institutional, systemic, and structural. Where are you? Are you connected to that in some way in your heart, right? How much empathy and compassion are you able to be connected with it? And I had to ask myself that question as well. The second piece around mind, in my mind, the proximity to the matter. Are you really understanding the history behind this system, right? this system that dates back hundreds of years, but even such that are you understanding of the history of Reconstruction as it moves into Jim Crow, as it moves into the Civil Rights Movement, as it moves into redlining, as it moves into the prison industrial complex? Like, are you privy of the history? Because I believe an empathetic person, a compassionate person, must understand not only the experience, the current experience, but also the history of the experience. And so that's getting proximate to the matter. The second piece, though, he speaks on is really about, are you willing, are we willing to do what's uncomfortable and inconvenient?
Right.
And inconvenient being the key word in that statement.
Right.
You know, I like to say that, you know, being uncomfortable and being inconvenient means that I believe that we must ask a question and answer a call. The question that we must ask is, again, back to the first point, is, you know, what's this role that we have in this system, right? What are we playing? What role am I playing as a Black man? But what role are you playing as a white female in America, or a Latina in America? Like, what role are you playing? And not in a judgment way, not in an attacking way, but in an introspective way, right? And then after asking that question, answering the call, right? So it's answering the call to serve. And it's a big call, because for many of us, it's an uncomfortable and inconvenient call, because our circles are not reflective of that type of service. Our experiences may not be reflective of that type of service. And so when we answer that call, are you willing to answer the call so that all Black lives do indeed matter in our laws, in our courts, in our hospitals, in our systems, in our schools, in our communities? These are the places where service is necessary. So even from where you are as a leader, you don't need to go far. You don't need to have the heaviest of lifts. You can actually ask that question and answer that call from exactly where you are. And that, to me, those are key in our ability to kind of make sense of all of what's going on, all of what's transpiring in this movement and in that progress.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting reality, right? We've talked about being uncomfortable. I think people have, to a certain extent, embraced it and understood, well, my capacity and my knowledge around the history and how this has played out needs to be elevated in order for me to do some of this work. And I've seen, you know, staff, program leaders, mentors really reach out and talk about, you know, as we're working with young people, what do I need to know? And you can't run away from, if you don't know your history, you're not going to understand how things got to where they are, right? And that's one sliver of it. But then the asking the question, to your point of, as we're experiencing this universe together, how do I create environments that are intentional and inclusive, to the point that I'm extremely uncomfortable because I didn't realize that I was making others uncomfortable. And that's a real sort of being present completely as you're doing the work. And it shows up for us in different ways. I know I've had a lot of conversations about even something as simple as parent engagement, right? And you know, and I hear programs say, you know, what's wrong with all these parents? They don't show up and they're not responsive. And because we work with a particular segment of the community, then it feels like you're judging all parents in that way. And what I try to tell everyone is, well, let's take a look at where it's working in other places. Why is it working in other places? How are those constructs not even parent friendly half the time, right? For a certain group of parents who might have multiple jobs or multiple challenges in being able to meet the requirements. So a lot of times we make this leap from non-engagement must be about non-caring, and this is why this problem exists, right? Versus non-engagement being a part of, you know, there are tons of challenges. Why don't we try to tackle some of those challenges for those parents so that we can have a different type of engagement? And I think that you know, what COVID has shown us when we've all had to run home and start working from home and have webinar discussions like this and recreate services has taught us is that there's multiple ways that we can do that level of outreach and engagement and get out of our own way sometimes and making sure that we're not passing the judgment without really looking at, well, how do we create this construct that allows for that engagement to happen, right? And that's just one simple example of ways in which sometimes we create systems that create barriers for the desired outcome to happen. And it's much easier to say that it's because it's this type of parent or this type of segmented population or this type of reality. And so, what I would love to push our leaders within the youth movement to really understand is as we start to see challenges, that we try to figure out how to suspend the judgment and as
Yeah.
an organism determine how to tackle the challenge, right? Because once we start doing that, we really start to provide service in a more equitable way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's key. I mean, we've had this conversation. You and I definitely know back years ago
Yeah,
about parent engagement, right? I think that's a great example, honestly. It's the same level of when governments look at community engagement and the lack thereof, voting and the participation in certain communities. But if we aren't close enough to communities that are not showing up, there's a reason. There's a
right,
reason why they don't show up, right? Yeah, people can say it's just because they don't care, but that's just too easy. I think
right,
that's a cop out answer. It's just they don't care. What we know is, and what research tells us, is that most people actually who have children do care.
right.
That's just science, like data, or data at least. Research tells us that most people do care, but if we're not proximate, if we're not close enough, if we're not reconstructing our way of thinking and engaging and being inconvenienced to do something different, right? To understand more, then we're missing a great opportunity because indeed, these young people that we're serving, the communities that we're serving, they have been cast aside on purpose for decades, for hundreds of years. And
Mhm.
so my hope is that we take a moment like this again, right, when all is in front of us, that we ask ourselves the tough question: how close are we to the matter? How close are we to the circumstances, so that we think a little differently, we think a little more open-mindedly, that we don't pass that judgment that we humans do all the time, that we hold on to that judgment and we step in with more love, with more empathy, with more caring, and more curiosity about actually what's happening.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We tell our mentors and people who are working with young people, your curiosity is necessary to uncover
Yeah.
sort of where young people are at. But I think it's the same skill we have to start sort of providing across the board as we're looking at this, right? And
Yeah.
really becoming a critical thinker about those systems. Um,
Mhm.
I'm curious that as you're doing this work, so I guess I have to do something and tell you, you need to plug your book and say the title of your book again, because I've only said it once. And it's not every day we have an author in our presence. So you should say the book again, because I'm sure people want to know. Actually, it's in one of the question box. Please mention your book again. So please let me know.
Sure, thank you. No, it's the book is called Heart Work. So Heart Work. It was like the 50th title, and it stuck. And Heart Work: 19 Expressions of Heart-Centered Leaders. It's a personal story, my personal story of moving from a place of trauma and hurt as a young person to trying to figure out this life that I was so trying to understand what was happening around me. But the story aligns, though, with heart-centered leadership expressions and the connection. And so within each chapter, the first 9 chapters is a story, is a personal story, but also each chapter ends with a learning development exercise that connects with that story. So it allows the reader to take a moment, honestly, after reading the chapter and then experience the learning development exercise in their own time. And it's right in the book. So the book doubles as a book, as a storytelling book, as a non-fiction book, but also a learning development book. And then the last chapter, the 10th chapter, is are 10 expressions. And so it's more heavily geared towards interpersonal growth and development. The first part of the book, the first 9 chapters, are more intrapersonal. And so it's a fully developed book around your learning and personal reflection as you take your time to figure out your own heart work. And so it took me around 3 years to finish. And, I cried in many of the chapters as I wrote them, really kind of going through. But it's a great opportunity. I appreciate you, allowing me to share it with everyone. I believe that those who have read it already, pre-read it, they walk away feeling not judged because they see that other people are going through some of the same things, but they also feel inspired that they are built inherently great. They are built with a sense of joy and purpose, and that we just have to do the personal work, the personal growth work to really access it. I always say that we can't find purpose because there's no need to find it because it's already within you. And the same goes with so many other things in life that connect to heart-centered leadership. So that's the book, and I appreciate that, though. I want everybody to grab it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at this time it's so relevant, right? It's in order
Yeah.
for us to make these huge changes that really are transformative in community, we have to understand where we live and lie in those things with ourselves, that we
Yeah.
show up certain ways. One of the things I usually caution staff and individuals working with young people is that you can't project your stuff onto them. You're not the therapist. You're part of the experience of them determining what's fun, what's joyful. Um, how do I articulate an emotion, right? Because something didn't go right. And so it's their own sort of, you are creating an open platform for them to explore with some trust how they are going to navigate their external world. And those things are really necessary. And I think sometimes we get really prescriptive about character development and academic outcomes. And it's like, yeah, that's all important. Not going to knock it. Super necessary. There are
Yeah.
problems with academics. There are problems around getting ready, being career ready, and being college ready. All those things are necessary. But if they show up to those places with just skills and no access to the core of their goodness, their wellness, their brilliance, then we missed out, right? And so
Yeah.
that's a really important part of what I like about sort of the center of the book. It forces us to do that with everyone in our environments.
100%, right? It's the work that, as I even wrote the book over the past few years, looking at my kids and really writing the book and then experiencing much of it with my children and with my wife, right? I start the book off when I was 5 years old. Like that's where I start the book. And I worked through my professional and personal experiences and marriage and having children and the ebbs and flows of all of these experiences. But to your point, our young people, this book is something that young people can read as well. And I believe that it's never too early to begin to have those discussions about the power of the heart, the power of our ability to be with ourselves, because it's not a bad thing to sit with ourselves and to feel in those moments pain, right? Back to Pema Chodron, being present, even in pain, is very important, because once we decide to get distracted from our hard work, once we decide to push aside that painful moment, that trauma moment, we can never get that authentic moment back. And what happens is it builds and builds and builds. And over time, it becomes a part of who we are, and we don't even realize it. And we begin living as a life, as a person, as a leader, with trauma that has been embedded in us, deeply inside of us, that we never addressed. And that was a part of my story. I had so much inside of me that I'd never been present with. I'd never done that hard work, and it was coming out in ways that I couldn't understand, and definitely had to change. And so I think it's critically important, not for seasoned leaders or older leaders, but for young people also to take part in this type of work and this type of book.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we talk about the capacity of how do you teach leadership skills, right? It's always from
Yeah.
an authoritarian, people should respect you, and, you have to know how to lead. And by the way, try to create a healthy culture. And we all know that healthy cultures are created by the individuals that sit in the room. And
Yeah.
how you show up dictates how well that culture will play itself out. And so I always, I know I used to say this all the time, we can't run youth organizations with a cold and think that it's not going to be contagious and the children won't get the cold, right? It's like,
Yeah.
no, people are paying attention and they actually mimic you. And we've
Yeah.
been in organizations where people who are unhealthy behave a certain way, and everybody else sort of says, oh, that's just Susie's way, and it's like, what? But Susie's way is impacting the entire construct, right?
Yeah.
And so it is an interesting reality to say, you can't show up and lead or do this work with other people unless you're really looking at where you are within. And so I think that that's really important. One of the things I want to sort of elevate, because I think that this is really real, and for folks outside of New York it's going to become extremely real. The amount of loss that our young people have experienced in trauma in the last 3 to 4 months has been almost, you can't even articulate for some young people. I've had colleagues who work with high school students who do the amazing thing of being able to be the first to graduate from high school on scholarships, heading to college, but have lost two of their matriarchs and leaders of their families, right, within
Yeah.
months of that reality for them. And that's probably in its most extreme cases, but if you had someone who was sick with COVID or passed with COVID, there's rituals around illness and death that COVID has stripped our young people of, right? I can't see the person who's ill while they're ill, so there's no process of understanding how severe it gets. You lose them and you can't see them in their loss, and there's no sort of kickoff to a grieving process that we tend to have some understanding of. And then the social and religious rituals are gone as well, right? Because you can't get family together to celebrate life and to grieve, which as a young person are the first lessons of coming in tune with that pain of loss, and then understanding that love can allow you to manage through loss, right? And
Yeah.
so in the absence of that, the burden that we have as adults is huge, right? um,
Yeah.
do you have some thoughts and ways that potentially adults need to show up
Yeah.
for young people? Because um, I think people need to connect with that in some kind of way.
1,000%. Right. I think, again, when we, let's just, I just want to preface my statement by having, when we have conversations with young people, obviously when we think about working with young people, I always like to preface saying, we want to have age appropriate conversations, right? And so you have to be able to, calculate for yourself, what, the age and the appropriate type of conversation that you can have. That being said, I do believe though that as adults, we have to be able, to be vulnerable.
I think I lost your audio. I'm sorry. I
Now,
think now I can hear you. Yes, I'm
now you
sorry.
can hear me.
Yep.
Sorry. So I was saying, I think adults need to be honest and open and vulnerable when we're having these conversations with young people. Um, I think that we, in many cases, try to shield young people when we have these types of conversations, or when we're thinking about having these types of conversations. But honestly, this is a moment where young people, they see what's going on. I have a 5 and a 6 year old, and we talk about COVID and we talk about loss of life because they see it. They see it's happening. They understand to a large degree about death, and so we let them understand that we're hurting, and that it's hurting us, and that times are changing. But young people are the most adaptable people. They are the most resilient people because when they're so young, they are actually, their minds and their hearts are wide open to the possible, not the impossible. And so I would say that first and foremost, our ability to be authentic, to be vulnerable, to be courageous in a moment where we want to shield ourselves and shield our children,
Mhm.
I think these are the moments that we actually do the opposite. These are the moments where we become vulnerable for them, where we allow them to see us cry, see us hurt, talk about why we're crying, why we are hurting, why what's happening is such a powerful, tragic, yet hopeful time for us, and allow them to share back with us, to ask us questions. What does this mean? Where will this go? Where will this end? And we must be okay. I know this is going to be big for a lot of adults. We must be okay if we don't know the answer.
Yeah.
We must show our young people that we won't always have the answer. It won't be as clear sometimes. And in those moments, we have done something doubly for them in this kind of duality of senses. We have demonstrated vulnerability and courage and authenticity, and we have shown them that there is no perfect person. There is no built perfect response or answer to tragedy and loss. And I think we do them a great service when we connect with them in that way, in that manner, that fashion.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I think that pretending like our kids are okay is not okay anymore.
No,
Like, we
no,
have to have the conversation about loss. We have to have the conversation about race. We have to ask the tough questions about their experiences.
yeah,
Whether they can put words like racism or microaggressions around those experiences, um, isn't important. It's being able to articulate what happened and how did that make you feel, and that does put you in a vulnerable situation because it is hard to hear
yeah,
sometimes young people share what has happened to them, but we
yeah,
have to do it. And I think just in having this conversation with you, one of the things I think is important is, as program staff who are supporting mentors or people in the front line with young people, you got to get adults together to talk about how they show up, and that they have a support system that says, yeah, this is going to be a hard conversation, and here's how I navigate it, or what did you do? I think as parents, we also isolate ourselves and don't talk about the true challenges sometimes because we don't want anyone to know that there's some ugly in there and some like, oh my gosh, I
yeah,
had no idea. You want to know, you want everybody to think you're the cool parent in the block.
yeah.
Um, but I think that we have to have those conversations. And to your point, even doing that has a level of vulnerability that then allows you to be vulnerable with young people. So I think that's really key.
Yeah.
Um, so in the final few minutes that we have, I know we have questions coming in like crazy. We only have a few sort of minutes, but there's one that sort of popped up, and I wanted to go back to it very quickly.
Hmm.
There's so many, but we'll answer them in mentoring take two. But this whole coolness, emptiness you talked about,
Yeah.
can you talk to me a little bit more about what that is and
Yeah.
sort of how you navigate it? Because it popped up a couple of times in the question. So I figured let's address that one before we sign off.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. So again, the author Pema Chodron, the Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist, she speaks about cool emptiness in a sense of really, to make it really simple, it's the place that you go, that you may find yourself in, where you feel empty because of whatever may be happening around you. There's so many people right now that are feeling empty because they can't maneuver like they have in the past. She calls it a cool emptiness. She terms it cool emptiness, really because it's your place where you're kind of chill, right? You're just sitting there, just in the moment. Our gut reaction is to get out of there. It's to run because I don't want to think about these things. I'm crying, I'm hurting, I'm in pain. But the reality of it is that this is the moment. The cool emptiness is the place where we want to sit with ourselves. We want to feel every single bit of what we're experiencing because that moment, again, is a unique moment and it's an authentic moment. And cool emptiness is that place where you can go be with your heart, with your mind in a still place. That's cool emptiness. Um, can everyone be there? Uh, Not everybody. You may have to take small steps to where you feel comfortable being there. But I believe that it's achievable for most people to be able to get to that place, to not run from it, to not get distracted from it with Netflix, and nothing against Netflix. I love them. But with, binging shows, and whether it be alcohol and drugs, I talk about that in the book. I talk about how I try to distract myself through alcohol and drugs and everything else that wouldn't place me in this cool emptiness space if you're able to get those distractions out of your mind and out of your heart and sit with yourself and allow yourself to feel what you're feeling. That's cool emptiness. And that's a place that we can begin to recover, to
Yeah, I think that sorry.
grow, to learn. Go ahead.
So sorry, I know you're paused for a second, but I did want to say I think that at this time, with everything going on, I think it is a place that we have to sort of um, live in our realities and not run from, especially since we're physically distancing and socially distancing. I think it's a very a reality that we have to live in our own sort of cool emptiness to really be able to do this work effectively. So Glenn, I really want to thank you for taking the time for spending this hour with us in our wellness webinar series. For our participants, it is noon and we want to stay on track. You will see a barcode on the screen. If you put your phones to the function of a picture, as if you were taking a picture, and hold it up to the barcode, the survey will actually come up so that you could give us feedback on this webinar. We are going to record our Mentoring Take Two to answer all your questions, and we will send that out to all of you, and we will also be sending a link to the survey. But thank you all for spending the morning with us and having this conversation, and I hope that you have an amazing afternoon. Glenn, as always, it's a pleasure. You always fill my heart and my mind. And I hope that people took something from this, because this is really going to be a journey for us. Reopening started in New York, but it might not stay around. We are still deep knee in wave one, with the rest of the country really experiencing what we've experienced here in New York. So I hope you and your family stay safe. Thank you for the conversation, and thank you everyone for attending. It's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful day and afternoon. Take care.